Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021, and therefore members are attending in person. Members that are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. And I believe for now we don't have any members actually physically present in the room. Is that correct, Mr. Clerk?
That's correct, Madam Chair. No members in the room.
Okay. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen are not permitted, given the ongoing pandemic situation and consistent with public health recommendations. All those that are in the room in person, including the staff, they are to maintain a 2-meter physical distance, must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room, and it is highly recommended that the mask be worn at all times, including when seated. You must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the provided hand sanitizer at the front entrance of the room. As the chair, I will, with the help of the clerk, be enforcing these measures during the duration of the meeting. Members and witnesses, for those all participating virtually, members and witnesses may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of floor English or French. And with the latest Zoom version, you may now speak in the language of your choice without the need to switch to the corresponding language selection. For members participating in person, well, there's nobody participating in person today. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. For those, if there are any substitutions that come in the room, they'll have their mic automatically controlled for them. And a reminder that all comments should be made through the chair with regard to a speaker's list, which I think will come in very handy today. I'll be following the toolbar, obviously, and the raised hand feature there. So just continue to raise your hands. We are on committee business, and I want to remind you all that there are several motions before the committee to consider. It's up to the committee members as to how they want to proceed and move forward in today's meeting and the discussion that they want to have about what they think this committee should be occupied with in the coming days. The last meeting, just a reminder for everyone, if you weren't here, the meeting was adjourned on March 25th. And at that time, we were on Ms. Vecchio's motion. Right now, we've got notices of motion from Daniel Blakey, Monsieur Terrien, and there's 3 motions that Monsieur Terrien has regarding translation and interpretation. They were submitted February 23rd. Mr. Blakey's was submitted November 17th, but we've been circulated a new motion as well. Ms. Pettypot Taylor has one on political entities, submitted March 23rd. Mr. Turnbull also has a motion before the committee regarding the Ontario Superior Court decision, which was submitted March 23rd. And then just yesterday, one a revised, I don't know if it's a revised, we'll let Mr. Daniel Blakey speak to that, I guess maybe a little later if he has an opportunity, that there's a new motion on electoral reform and I would say, and constituent assemblies, a little bit revised from the last motion. And there's another motion that has been just put on notice by Mr. Nader that has just circulated. But anyways, the few motions that have been brought to my attention as of the last day or so, haven't been moved in the committee as of yet. So I will move on to the hands that we have up and the speakers list. But I just wanted you guys to all be aware of all the things that have come before the committee as of late, especially the ones just as of the last few days. So Ms. Vecchio, you are first on the speakers list.
Thank you very much. And I was just going to say about getting back to the business that we had regarding on March 25th regarding the request for the Prime Minister and additional members to come here. So I just wanted to bring that back to the floor as part of our discussion for today so that we could finish the work and get to a vote on this. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ms. Vecchio has moved to have debate on I guess we were on the amendment to Ms. Vecchio's motion on that issue. Would anyone like to speak to that issue? Okay, next we've got Dr. Duncan.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just a clarification, please. Oh, am I off mute?
Yeah, you're off mute. You're off mute. We can hear you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A clarification. Have we continued to debate based on, can you just clarify,
yes,
please?
Yes, I can clarify. We are back on Ms. Vecchio's motion, and we left off on Ms. Vecchio's motion on March 25th. Before adjourning, we were on an amendment to her motion. So that, I guess, would automatically put us back on that amendment, and she'd like to see a vote and or any further debate on that, and then an eventual vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for clarifying. So we are back on the amendment that was brought forward by Mr. Turnbull, correct?
Correct.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I will be saying how much I appreciate the amendment that was brought forward by my friend and colleague, Mr. Turnbull. I have been clear that I think it would be really important to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. I will also make the same point that I have repeatedly made, namely that there is nothing more important than the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is where our sole focus should be. Canada is in the third wave of COVID-19. We are in a race between the variants and the vaccines, and our health system in Ontario is literally on the verge of collapse. Ontario field hospitals are being readied, but it's not just beds that are needed. Critical care staff are needed. We are hearing that this is absolutely unprecedented, and I quote, that this is the nightmare scenario we were all afraid of. And yet, this committee remains focused on a political motion. Our country reported over 9,200 COVID-19 infections on Friday. That was a new single high since the start of the pandemic. We have had the highest number of COVID-19 cases, and yet there's a partisan motion. Worldwide, more than 2,850,000 people have lost their lives worldwide. And all of us, we have lost them. Globally, new COVID-19 cases rose for a sixth consecutive week, with over 4 million cases reported in the last week. The number of new deaths also increased by 11% compared to the previous week, with over 71,000 new deaths reported. Far too many healthcare workers have died in the pandemic. Millions have been infected, and the pandemic has taken a huge toll on their physical and mental health, with devastating effects on their families and communities. Anxiety, depression, insomnia, stress have all increased. And yet, we have a partisan motion. The pandemic is exposing, exploiting, and exacerbating inequalities. COVID-19 has pushed an estimated 120 million people into extreme poverty last year. Gender inequalities have increased, with more women than men leaving the labor force. And rich countries are vaccinating their populations while the world's poor watch and wait. Health inequalities are not just unfair, they make the world less safe and less sustainable. Yet there is the partisan motion. Here in Canada, we have had over 1 million COVID-19 cases. COVID-19 has claimed more than 23,250 Canadians. That's another 1,250 Canadians since I updated this committee on March 6th. In fact, when I was repeatedly interrupted at this committee. Madam Chair, I cannot imagine what could be more important than talking about COVID-19, the race between the variants and the vaccines, and what this committee could actually do to ensure preparedness for pandemics going forward. The number of deaths are not just numbers. They were our grandparents, mothers, fathers, loved ones, neighbors, colleagues, lifelong friends, mentors, and heroes. And they mattered to so many more people. All of us should be asking about the number of outbreaks of COVID-19 in hospitals right now, the number of healthcare workers who have developed COVID-19, and the number of healthcare workers who have ended up in ICU. All of us should be asking about the number of outbreaks in essential workplaces, in marginalized communities, in congregate settings. A century after the 1918 influenza, poverty, hunger, well-being, gender, racialization, and economic status still play a role in who gets sick, who gets treated, and who survives COVID-19. Non-emergency surgeries are on hold in Ontario hospitals as COVID-19 takes hold, despite a backlog of postponed surgeries from the past year approaching 250,000. Ontario has not ordered such an across-the-board postponement of non-emergency surgeries since the first wave of the pandemic hit the province in March 2020. Dr. Kevin Smith, who's the CEO of the University Health Network, has written, "This is going to be the most extraordinary and demanding time most of us have had in our working lives. It comes to us after a very long year, which has left us feeling battered and drained." They are battered and they are drained. In the words of one physician, it's never ending, high stress, and I'm actually afraid. I've never been afraid, but it's different with the variants. You have no idea what we see, the fear from the patient, the fear of families saying goodbye over Zoom, the fear of our families when we come home. It's unrelenting. But here we are, focused on a partisan motion. Let me be clear, we are still fighting the pandemic. Canada's cases have increased 82% over the last 14 days. In Ontario, more COVID-19 patients are in the ICU than at any other point during the pandemic. The expectation is that we are locked in for a 5 to 7% daily increase in hospital admissions for the next 2 weeks. The number of new variant cases more than doubled in the last week. Canada's chief public health officer has said the rapidly spreading variants have now likely replaced the original virus as more young people are getting sicker. To date, and this is a few days old now, more than 26,000 cases linked to variants of concern have been reported in Canada. The variant initially reported in the United Kingdom accounts for more than 90%. The variant first identified in Brazil We've had more than 1,000 cases in Canada after doubling in the last week alone. The variant from South Africa is also picking up momentum with cases in Ontario and Quebec. Hospital admissions are also on the rise as healthcare staff try to keep up with overflowing ICUs. Experts say the number of COVID-19 patients in ICUs continue to test hospital capacities with patients battling the disease. My friends, what we should be discussing at this committee, we've done really good work in the past. Together, we have done really good work. We did important work that allowed remote voting so that MPs weren't traveling back and forth to their communities and potentially spreading the virus. We did really important work in saying what was needed should there be an election during a pandemic. Well, now we have to step up again. We have to step up and do the work that's incumbent upon us. We need to look at what Parliament, the House of Commons response, so that we can make recommendations for when the next pandemic comes along. We need to do that work. But I'll come back to the motion that's before us. The original motion prejudges the need for prorogation. Mr. Turnbull's amendment refocuses the study on prorogation with research, evidence, and facts, and re-inviting our Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion, and Youth. The Prime Minister prorogued in order to take the time needed to take stock of Canada's situation. How were Canadians doing? Where were we in the pandemic? How was the pandemic affecting jobs and livelihoods? How had wave one affected our seniors, and particularly those in long-term care? Where should we go as a country after looking at the science, evidence, and fact, and hearing directly from Canadians? I remember this past spring when our Conservative colleagues wanted in-person Parliament, with MPs traveling back and forth to Ottawa, possibly spreading the infection. When they wanted in-person voting in Ottawa rather than electronic or remote voting. When dealing with a new disease, it's important to acknowledge that not everything is known. It's important to exercise precaution. With a new disease and new science and data, information will likely change, and there will likely need to be adjustments and guidelines, policies, and recommendations. If we look at what was known last January versus what is known today, there are a lot of differences. The role of aerosols, the role of indoor versus outdoor spaces, and the role of masks. Scientific knowledge evolves over time, and decision makers have to be open, flexible, and willing to change course. Decision makers must stay humble in the face of a new virus. Colleagues, we're in the third wave. It is incumbent upon us to do our work so that in the future, the House of Commons, Parliament can be better prepared. If the Deputy Prime Minister were here, we could ask about the evidence. We could ask about what consultations were taken during prorogation. And it is for this reason I am supporting my friend and colleague, Mr. Turnbull, and his amendment. I am here to represent the constituents of Etobicoke North. We are a caring, strong, resilient community. Many of our community members are essential workers. I am also here to debate the amendment at hand, which is to invite several ministers to appear in front of this committee. I support the amendment, as I said earlier. But I would like to give further arguments as to why I think it's important to reinvite ministers. And speaking for my constituents, I will first talk about COVID-19, as this is what is first and foremost.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Vecchio?
I'm just wondering, we're referring back to the invitations, but I believe that these, the deputy or Minister Chager had already been perhaps invited, or has she been invited previously? And if so, in the last 3 to 4 months, has she responded to those invitations? Because we're debating something, but we already know that there was already a motion, an invitation has been sent. So perhaps we could actually find out from those ministers that we've invited, who in the last 3 months have actually answered and said that they'll be coming, or have they not answered back to this committee? And now we're just continuing this filibuster, yet they haven't even answered to the first request.
Yeah, I'm not assuming, I guess Mr. Turnbull's amendment calls for them to be re-invited, and maybe the clerk can help us with the first invitations as to whether there has been a response. We didn't get an opportunity, I guess, to chat about that in the last 2 weeks, but I can tell you as of March 25th, there was no response. And maybe, Justin, you can let me know if I'm correct that there might not be one up to date.
Madam Chair, you are correct. To date, there has not been a response to the committee's invitation to Minister Chager, Minister Freeland, or the Prime Minister. We are still waiting.
So point of order. So Madam Chair, we are right now debating re-inviting people who have already not responded. So perhaps we could, they're saying they want to do this, but I appreciate all of the, the words that we have here today, but we have already sent these invitations out, not just once, but they've been re-invited. And now we're talking about wanting to re-invite them again. This is wasting our time because we already have, and they haven't responded. So perhaps we can talk about, we're just talking about, let's re-invite them. Well, they haven't come. How many birthday parties are we going to invite to them until we stop inviting them? I'm just wondering where we're actually going here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Vecchio. So we've invited them once. We haven't re-invited as of yet. I guess there's been no decision made on that. And that's the issue we're currently on. And I guess I'll give it back to Ms. Duncan. Maybe there can be an eventual vote on this as to whether we should re-invite these ministers or not. Dr. Duncan.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. In speaking for my constituents, and again, I'm going to say I absolutely think we should be re-inviting. I will talk about COVID-19. This is first and foremost what is affecting their lives. And I will speak about the issues which matters most in our community. I want people to understand the years 2020 and 2021 are historic. It's been over 100 years since the 1918 influenza pandemic, sickened about 500 million people, about 1/3 of the world's population. The disease killed about 50 million worldwide. It was the deadliest pandemic of the 20th century. COVID-19 is tragically historic. It is not finished. Rather, the pandemic continues to inflict unprecedented harm on people, societies, economies around the world. And the pandemic has pushed the world towards one of the worst recessions in modern times and is having a devastating effect on the most vulnerable countries and peoples. The progress the world has made on eradicating poverty and hunger, increasing opportunities for all, and reducing inequalities within countries, between countries, is being eroded. And I will just finish by saying, I can't be clearer. We are in the third wave. The focus for our constituents is protecting their health and safety, protecting their jobs and livelihoods as variants continue to spread, as we are in a race between the vaccines and the variants. We don't need politics right now. This committee has a very important job. We have all been living this. We've experienced this. I think it is upon all of us to actually look at the House of Commons response to make sure that we do this important work like we've done the important work in the past, and that we can make recommendations so that we are better prepared going forward. And Madam Chair, I look forward to speaking later, but I will turn it over to one of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Mr. Kevin Lamoureux, nice to have you back. I know you had your hand up last time.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And you're right, I did have my hand back. I was kind of hoping to at least get on the record the last time we had met a couple of weeks ago. But fortunately for myself, I'll be able to get on the record now. And it's such a pleasure. It really and truly is to be back on PROC and to actually be afforded the opportunity to be able to speak. You know, it's been a number of years. I've always thought of PROC as one of those standing committees that is held in fairly high esteem, Madam Chair, as you and other members are no doubt aware. Often other committees will look in terms of what's happening in PROC, and things that take place in PROC often will disseminate out to other committees. And you know, for many years I served in PROC, in particular while I was in opposition. Since being in government, some members have preferred that I maybe not attend PROC because I was a parliamentary secretary, maybe too strongly linked to it. But nowadays, given what's taken place, and you know, the Deputy House Leader, I think, had it right on. You know, I don't think anyone could have said it any better. And the way in which she often speaks, I always find very inspiring. She speaks at a level that demonstrates or embodies, I think, that what all politicians strive for, and that's to have that emotional passion, the connection with real people, demonstrating so well how we need to care for people. And that is something that I think she is second to no other inside the House of Commons in terms of just her ability to empathize and sympathize with the public as a whole and as an individual, Madam Chair. And that's why I appreciate some of the words that she was starting to talk about in terms of what the priority of this government really is. You know, I've been afforded many opportunities to be able to address a wide variety of issues inside the House of Commons. And I've never, ever taken it for granted, nor have I ever taken for granted what takes place in this particular committee. This committee, I believe, needs to be able to demonstrate leadership that says that in a pandemic, that we can get the job done, the job that's necessary, that we're able to get it done, Madam Chair. And I must say, I am somewhat disappointed. I'm disappointed because I believe, in part, that there's a certain faction that's rooted within the Conservative House leadership team, but goes beyond that, where it's starting to play a very destructive force. And I've made reference to the destructive force inside the House of Commons and how it is that the opposition is using politics, partisan politics, at a time in which we want Canadians and others, including parliamentarians of all political stripes at all different levels, to work closer together. And I have...
Et j'ai eu l'occasion de voir ce qui se passe au sein du comité de la procédure. Et voici ce que j'ai vu. Il y a l'opposition officielle qui s'assure en fait que le comité de la procédure ne soit pas capable de faire le travail qu'il devrait être en train de faire. Et on s'intéresse plutôt à faire tout ce qu'on peut pour faire de l'obstruction.
Government members in this particular situation to try to focus members of the standing committee on what Canadians are so passionate about today. And there is so much more that the PROC committee could be doing. And I want to be able to get into some of that, but not until I get rid of a few frustrations, I must say, that I have. Earlier today is probably a good example. I actually was going into the chamber anticipating that the member from Elmwood Transcona was going to be moving a concurrence motion. And I must say, I was getting a little agitated. I was thinking, why would they want to move another concurrence motion, especially coming from PROC? Because the member from Elmwood Transcona would be very much aware of C-19. And I'm sure that members of PROC are concerned about an election. After all, in a minority situation, no one knows when the election is going to occur. We continue to do whatever we can to stay focused on the pandemic and minimizing the negative impacts of the pandemic. But on the other hand, a part of that is that we need to be ready. And as I say, the role that PROC plays is absolutely critical. So when I was going in this morning, I had received a text. I'm not too sure exactly where it came from, but it implied that the NDP were going to be moving a motion of concurrence on an election report. Now, I know the member from Elmwood and Transcona is listening, and I suspect that was his intent this morning. Now, I'm not trying to impute motives. I don't want to go against Beau Cheynes here, but I can tell you that, or I would ask if that was the intent, and the only reason why it didn't happen is because the Conservatives moved another motion of concurrence. And right away, I'm starting to think, well, here we go again, Madam Chair, where opposition is trying to frustrate the government. We are trying to deal with substantial pieces of legislation, and the opposition want to play games. And so in one sense, I was expecting the member from Elmwood Transcona to bring forward his concurrence motion. And then I was hearing that, well, they were going to ask for leave to have the debate occur later on in the day after the House was going to adjourn. Now, I suspect at some point in time, the member from Elmwood Transcona will provide some clarification if that is what was being the plan. But if that was the plan, and here's why it's so important, Madam Chair, to this particular committee. When we talk about the agenda, when we talk about what it is that we should be talking about or could be talking about, staying focused on what the Deputy House Leader was talking about, and that is the pandemic, C-19 is completely relevant and would be a wonderful thing for PROC to be dealing with, Madam Speaker. I was kind of hoping that maybe I would get the opportunity in that concurrence debate to be able to go into details about the PROC report. In fact, first thing I did is I called it up onto my computer in anticipation that we were going to see a concurrence motion. Now, that would not have been my first choice, because as the government has said day in and day out, that there is a legislative agenda that the government is trying to get through the House of Commons. At the same time, the government's focus is on the pandemic. So I would have preferred, if we were going to be debating something this morning that wasn't going to be, I believe it was C-22 that's being debated right now for the very first time, an important piece of legislation, that as opposed to debating the concurrence report, that we would in fact be debating Bill C-19. C-19 should have been a major discussion, a topic area for debate inside the House weeks ago. It's been there for a long time now, sitting. We've actually attempted.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
We have called the legislation.
Sorry, who raised the point of order?
It's Karen Vecchio.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if there's any information when it comes to misleading, because he's talking about Bill C-19 and he's fully misleading everybody. It's been scheduled twice for an hour and once for 2 hours. So he's totally misleading any Canadians that are watching right now. Thank you.
Well, Madam Chair, on the same point of order.
Maybe you can clarify, Mr. Lamoureux. I'm not aware of the scheduling, but also just wanted to let you know about the amendment that we are on as well.
Sure.
So that, yeah.
Madam Chair, I believe
Ms.
Vecchio was concerned about me misrepresenting the truth. And I can assure the committee member and all committee members that everything that I have said is 100% accurate and can be demonstrated to be so by just looking at the record. So, for example, on one occasion in which C-19 was called, a motion of concurrence was brought in. The debate wasn't allowed to continue. And for me, in regards to your comments about the relevancy, Madam Chair, relevancy is important in all discussions that we have. And, when we talk about what has been taking place and happening in Procedures and House Affairs Committee, and having witnesses come forward, I would suggest to you that the Procedures and House Affairs in dealing with the pandemic, in dealing with witnesses and subject matters that it is completely responsible for, C-19 is one of such pieces of legislation. Now, I don't know if you want me to continue on, or if you wanted just to give me the green light to continue on, Madam Chair, because of the point of order.
I just do want to remind you, I know I've been, fairly gentle with everybody, but it's just a gentle reminder that we are currently on Mr. Turnbull's amendment to Ms. Vecchio's motion, which calls for witnesses to be reinvited, and those such witnesses are Minister Chagger, Minister Freeland, and I don't even have, I should have the amendment right before me, but you may as well, and I may pull it up again in front of me so that I can remind you, but he wishes to invite those witnesses and exclude the Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff from being on that list, which is currently on Ms. Vecchio's motion. And so that's essentially what we're looking at within the context of the prorogation study, which we've had several witnesses come before this committee on. And so we're at a crossroads, I guess, on that prorogation study at this point as to whether we should have more witnesses invited. There's a difference in I guess, a difference in positions as to which witnesses should be invited, if any, and some arguing that we should move on to the report stage of that study. So I guess that's essentially a synopsis of where we're at in different perspectives we're hearing from committee members.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and that is indeed quite helpful. I think that in approaching this, there is, a lot of validity in terms of just being able to talk as to why prorogation was in fact important and going through the different lines of the throne speech. But for now, I think what I'm going to continue to focus my attention on is the need to ensure that the Procedures and House Affairs Committee is able to remain focused on the pandemic. And Bill C-19 is one of those pieces of legislation that allows for Procedures and House Affairs to remain focused on the pandemic. Because of the changes to the Elections Act, Madam Chair. And I guess where I was kind of going with this was to point out earlier today inside the House of Commons where we had a little bit of frustration that was starting to get there dealing with concurrence reports. And from what I was hearing, a concurrence report was coming, or the idea of calling for a concurrence was coming from the New Democratic Party. And my advice was going to be that the New Democratic Party consider Bill C-19 as an area of debate for the floor of the House of Commons being more important, quite frankly, than the concurrence report that was being suggested, from what I understand, from my New Democratic friends. And the reason why I make that suggestion is that if you go through the report, this is something in which PROC did just a fantastic job on. And later on tonight, I hope to be able to go into a lot of the details of that particular report, because what it does is it ensures that going into, if there were to be an election during a pandemic, that Canadians could feel that much more comfortable because of things such as the work that PROC has done and the debate and discussions that would follow out of Bill C-19. So that's the reason why I would say that if we are going to encourage additional debate on the floor of the House, as opposed to having that concurrence report, that the member from Elmwood Transcona consider having and encouraging a debate on C-19. Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair, when we talk about prorogation and what has taken place in prorogation, and the calling of witnesses and the responsibility of standing committees, I had the opportunity just as recent as yesterday to talk about the calling of ministers to committee. And I can tell you, Madam Chair, that it started off from a member from the Conservative Party saying that they wanted more than just ministers to appear. And I went through what was taking place in the Finance Committee, and I used that as an example, Madam Chair. And maybe what I can do is I can repeat some of that I said yesterday, because I do believe it's relevant. When we talk about the importance of ministers and the ministers' roles at committee, I think it's really important that we recognize some of the things that have occurred in the past. You know, I go to Mr. Barrett's, who has played a leading role for the Conservative Party inside the House and in certain standing committees, where he has indicated, litany of individuals that he would like to see called before committees. And I had indicated to him about accountabilities and ministerial roles, and that how even under Stephen Harper's era, the minister played the critical role. And I gave one specific quote, and I'd like to repeat that because I do believe it's important here, Madam Speaker. And that is, it came from the Honorable Jay Hill. Now, for those members that aren't familiar with Mr. Hill, he was actually the leader of the government in the House of Commons back, 10 years ago or so. And in fact, if I look at it, it was on May the 25th, 2010, when Mr. Hill stated, and I quote specifically, "In our system of government, the powers of the Crown are exercised by ministers who are, in turn, answerable to Parliament. Ministers are individually and collectively responsible to the House of Commons for the policies, programs, and activities of government. They are supported in the exercise of their responsibilities by public servants and by members of their staff. Accordingly, responsibility for providing information to Parliament and its committees rest with the ministers." Now, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, as we look in terms of witnesses and the calling of witnesses, I think some of the more important witnesses in terms of government actions will be found through ministers. And the government has made ministers accessible and available for committees on a wide variety of different issues. I think in terms of cabinet ministers are accountable to the House of Commons for decisions of the government and of political staff. This is actually a very long-standing tradition of ministerial responsibility. In fact, there have been multiple House committees that have actually studied, for example, the student service grants. And that's what it is I was making reference to, Madam Speaker. But one could easily reference other committees at the same time. But if you look at that particular, the Finance Committee, which really amplifies what it is that a committee was able to do in terms of ensuring ministerial accountability, you had some incredible individuals appear before that committee at that political level, from the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth.
Point of order.
Yes, Ms. Vecchio?
Although I really appreciate this, and I recognize that his earlier speech was from the Defense Committee filibuster, I'm just sitting there, we're talking about this, but he's not referring back to the motion. We're talking about actually having ministers here. There seems to be one staff member on here, which is the Chief of Staff for the Prime Minister, but there's absolutely no relevance if we're talking about staff. There's only one staff member that has yet to be even discussed in the last 2 months of filibuster. So perhaps we can get on the genuine motion, which is looking at calling these ministers, including the Prime Minister. So I'm just hoping he can get back to the relevance and perhaps remind himself that he's at PROC committee, not Defense Committee, not a Finance Committee, not an Ethics Committee, where we've seen these exact same statements. Thank you.
Something I also left out last time is just wanted to let you know that I had just mentioned that in the amendment of Mr. Turnbull's to Ms. Vecchio's motion, there are also not just the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister Chaiger, but there are also other witnesses that are still being called forward once again, which is Bill Morneau, Craig Kielburger and Mark Kielburger. And I believe what has also been removed from Mr. Turnbull's amendment in comparison to Ms. Vecchio's motion is the speaker spotlight guests that were also invited. So they are still a part of Ms. Vecchio's original motion. Yeah, but they aren't a part of Mr. Turnbull's amendment. So just to give you some more information as to what the amendment what witnesses the amendment pertains to.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'm not exactly sure in terms of what the point was that Mrs. Vincenco was attempting to make there about relevancy. So I'm just going to continue on. I think, Madam Chair, when we talk about having people appear before committees, that we have seen through the last number of months, standing committees calling for and receiving a wide spectrum of ministers attending and using a finance committee and as an example, I think is a positive thing and hopefully will contribute to part of the discussion that is taking place when we talk about ongoing committee meetings and who we're going to be hearing from and so forth. I wanted just to be able to emphasize that committee because it's something in which I was just talking about yesterday inside the House as it was information that was provided to me. We had, as I indicated, the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. There was the former Minister of Finance. We had the Minister of Small Businesses and Export Promotion. We had the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability and Inclusion. Even the clerk of the Privy Council. We've seen endless other representations and committees heard in terms of private citizens, organizations. In fact, the government supplied, and this goes to, in part, what you were talking about, Madam Chair, in your explanation, and I do appreciate that, about information. And there was a great deal of information that was provided. And it seems to me that we have more than one committee that's attempting to do the same thing that other committees are doing. In this situation, when you talk about what was taking place in the Finance Committee, which was the We Charity issue, and what it is that PROC is looking at, and follow some of the debates that occurred back then, there are some common themes that are there. You know, there was like 5,000 pages of documents that was actually provided to the Finance Committee. 5,000 pages dealing with We Charity and the Canada Summer Students or Summer Youth Program. There were documents that were also incorporated and provided through by the Prime Minister's office. There were clerks that made presentation. You know, the leader of the government of the House has been very strong on the issue of what's taking place in standing committees, and recognizing that standing committees operate on their own, and it is the standing committee that will ultimately determine what their agenda is going to be. And I believe that is why it's so important that we protect as much as possible the interests of that independence of standing committees. And I believe what we have seen is an infection of sorts that is coming from primarily the official opposition, where their intent is to play partisan politics, even more so in our standing committees than we have seen before, Madam Speaker. I've had opportunities to participate in PROC discussions in regards to elections acts, the Election Act, and the calling of witnesses, and who it is that we should be listening to, and reports. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, I believe we even submitted some form of a minority report from the past. But, Madam Chair, my concern is that at the end of the day, what is it that the official opposition is attempting to achieve? We have indicated from day one our expectation of dealing with the coronavirus. And that is where our focus has been. And I would like to pick up on that, Madam Speaker. You know, just yesterday, the Prime Minister, and I know Ms. Duncan was there also, and so were you, Madam Chair, actually. We had a very special celebration. Today is Vaisakhi, and I would like to say happy Vaisakhi to all members of the committee, but to the broader population and those that are following it. Vaisakhi is a very special celebration. That's a celebration in our Indo-Canadian community, but many others, including myself, also acknowledge the importance of Vaisakhi and celebrate it. And a part of that celebration, as it was noted yesterday, was giving back, and how it is that we, as people, have a responsibility to give of ourselves to the community as a whole. And what was so nice about yesterday's event is it highlighted two things. It highlighted the richness of Canada's diversity, and it allowed us to be able to recognize that important issue that all Canadians are facing today, and that being the coronavirus. And that is what members of the Liberal caucus have been trying to get focused, whether it's in PROC or on the floor of the House. So at the celebration, that's what it was for me in recognition of Vaisakhi. We had the Prime Minister say a few words, but more importantly, listen to what healthcare workers from across Canada had to say about the pandemic and the impact that it was having on Canadians in a very real and tangible way. I think that all members of PROC would have actually benefited by listening to what was being said. Outside of myself, Ms. Duncan, and Ms. Sahota, we were blessed to have had so many wonderful people not only wish us happy Vaisakhi, but share with us their point of view as to what was taking place at the ground level and some of the things that we need to be working on. And there was a couple of them that really touched me and made me think in terms of, well, we need to spend more energy and more time talking about. You know, Ms. Duncan, as I look to you and recognize your science background, you know, we had the one doctor who talked about the backlogs that could be being created of cancer patients because we've been so focused on the pandemic, and the costs to our healthcare are so significant, and our resources, that we are not or have not been able to do some of the things that we've been able to do in the past in dealing with things like cancer detection. And what is going to be the impact of that, Madam Chair? I appreciated those thoughts. And I think that those are the types of issues that we need to be focusing on. And we can all, you know, choose and pick some very specific things. And to use a few examples, I think is good. Earlier in my comments, you know, I'm genuinely concerned that there could be an election. And if there is an election, we have legislation that is there. And that should be talked about. I understand that we have a motion before PROC today that's talking about witnesses, which is talking about indirectly prorogation and why that had taken place. And this is all related to it. What's taking place today is related to why it is prorogation was absolutely necessary back in August, which has caused the reason why it is PROC is where it is today. And I would ultimately argue, Madam Chair, that it is happening in that fashion because the Conservative Party has chosen to politicize. And that's why I think it's good to bring up some examples of what real Canadians are saying. Towards the end of the discussion yesterday, and it didn't get nowhere near as much time as I would have liked to have seen it, and I'm sure other members would have liked to have seen. And I know Ms. Pettipas-Taylor was a former Minister of Health, and she's very passionate on the issue of mental health. Can you imagine the impact on mental health because of the pandemic? And you wonder why it is that we wanted to refocus the House of Commons with a new throne speech? You know, you can only talk so much within the first hour or within 1 hour
And unfortunately, that was the limits that we had yesterday in recognizing Vaisakhi and listening to those frontline health care workers that worked from emergency room settings to community settings. And I can tell you that even though it didn't get as much time, I believe that we've got our work cut out for ourselves on the mental health issue. And there's absolutely critical that we reflect on the impacts that the pandemic has actually been having. You see, the prorogation ensured that the House of Commons was to refocus its attention, because the first throne speech that we provided actually talked more about the economy and going forward and the previous 4 years, where there was a lot of things that were done. And the throne speech that we heard back in September, I believe, allowed all of us, all political entities in the House, to recognize that there was a need for us to give our attention to what was the first priority of all Canadians. I was really, really encouraged yesterday when the Minister of Procurement indicated that we are now on track to get 44 million doses of vaccine by the end of June. We need to recognize that 37.5, I think, million people is the population of Canada, maybe a little bit more than that, 37.5 million. Depending in terms of how provinces prioritize and how they administer the vaccines, Canada is in good shape today for a wide spectrum of reasons. But when it comes to the ultimate answer of vaccines, we have reason to be optimistic and hopeful. And I think that that's the type of thing in which all of us, whatever political affiliation that we may have, can take some responsibility for, and start now encouraging even more people to get engaged with the whole vaccination process. Madam Chair, I look at the types of actions that we have seen from the government that encourage the prorogation. And we often talk about day one, when it first became very clear that we had something that we needed to be able to deal with, that there was no choice in the matter. I can remember getting ready for the budget of 2020-21. We had the pre-budget consultations, and which is fairly extensive in itself. We were getting ready to be able to ultimately present that budget to the floor of the House. And then we started to hear more about the pandemic. And we started to hear from the health experts, from World Health Organization, from nonprofits, from the private sector, from provinces. And the list goes on, Madam Chair. the Prime Minister made it very clear that the priority of the Government of Canada would be to have the backs of all Canadians, to be there in a very real and tangible way. And there was a high sense of cooperation. There was very much a Team Canada approach that we saw firsthand. We saw people of different political parties, different levels of government coming together and working out what was necessary in order to get us started on this path. Even the official opposition back then recognized the value of it, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair. We, with the support of so many, created programs that were absolutely non-existent prior. From nowhere to a program that served almost 9 million Canadians in every region of our country. Everyone knows it as CERB. Madam Chair, that was the beginning. And as we started to move more and more into it, we saw the need to hit the reset button. And that was a decision that the Prime Minister ultimately had to make. And I support that decision. I support that decision because it reflects what it is that Canadians expect of the government given the time. There was so much that was taking place. I can remember, how fluid things were in terms of changing. Remember first watching it. Well, wash your hands and, just wash your hands. Keep your hands clean seemed to be the message. Make sure that you're not, in your speaking, you're not, spitting either intentionally or unintentionally, obviously, on others. That's how it passed the coronavirus. Masks, they weren't compulsory. Virtually anywhere, they weren't being made compulsory. Remember, we were talking about stay below the curve. Everything was the curve. We talked so much about the curve. Remember the need for sanitizers. So you have it for your hands. The educational component was so high at the beginning. People had no real idea, as in general, what it is that they needed to do. They really did not. Instead, Madam Speaker, the first number of weeks going into months, it was about education. It was about coming up with the support programs. It was about remaining under the line, under the curve. And with the Team Canada approach that was almost completely universal, we made a difference in a significant way. It's because of the experiences in the first, through that first wave, that we were better able to deal with the second wave. Matt, 3 weeks into it, how many people could have gone to a store and bought hand sanitizer? Remember the toilet paper rush on toilet paper? PPE was very rare. We were fighting to get PPE. We didn't have the stuff being produced or manufactured here in Canada. It was that first wave that woke everyone up. And it was so encouraging to see that high sense of cooperation. Remember, I said that we were just getting started on the debate on the 2020-2021 budget. We were anticipating it. The House was going to be going ultimately up to a budget debate. But then it was agreed amongst all the political parties that we needed to come up with some sort of a hybrid system. Even before then, we recognized that we needed to take a break now and extend that break because of the coronavirus. How many of us back in March last year, had anticipated that we would be doing what we're doing today? Very few really understood it. Today, because of the education, because of the programs that we're putting into place, we are in a much better position. There should have been no surprise about the need for proroguing. That was something that I would have thought would have been almost a given. And quite frankly, it's a bit disappointing in terms of the resistance that was seen towards it. And I think, if you go back, my belief is that sometime between June and July, you started to see at least a different attitude that was coming from some members, in particular from opposition, where we started to see more partisan politics being brought in at the national level. I wish, that the partisanship that we saw back in April, May, in most of June of 2020 could come back. I think we would be able to accomplish so much more if we were able to see that happen, Madam Chair. And that is why, as I say, that we really did need to have the session prorogued. And, I appreciate and support the idea of having studies done through PROC on House procedural matters, including prorogation. I wouldn't have a problem arguing that this is probably one of the best examples that one could give for proroguing a session. I couldn't think of a better example. Maybe a war? But beyond that, it'd be pretty tough to convince me. I would have no problem at all comparing what our Prime Minister did in terms of the prorogation and the justification for it compared to the last time under a different administration that the session was prorogued. I wouldn't have any problem at all doing a comparison in between the two. And I suspect that most Canadians would in fact support what it is that the Prime Minister has actually done. Read through the throne speech. Maybe later on tonight I'll get that opportunity to go through the throne speech, and you'll see very clearly what's in that throne speech, and the focus of that throne speech is in fact about being there for a real and tangible way for Canadians. Madam Chair, I go back to the time in which I emphasized the importance of education, where very few of us had any real understanding of the depth of what it is that the world was getting into with the coronavirus. The death, the sickness, the cost to society have been enormous. Are there things that we could have done that could have been done better? I'm not arrogant to believe that we have been absolutely perfect. There have been at times a need for us to make adjustments. And we have done that. We have listened and made adjustments where it's been necessary to make those adjustments. I mentioned about a creation of programs. And there is a suite of programs that are out there as a result of the coronavirus. And we continue to make changes all the way up to legislation that was being debated yesterday, C-14. When we talk about being there and working together and trying to provide the supports that Canadians need, there's the two extremes. I started off a few minutes back talking about how we were working so well together back in April, May, and most of June. Contrast that to what's happening today. Look at C-14. I think it's an excellent example. And I don't know if it's because, minority governments typically last 18 months. And I don't know if it's, some people are getting the edge that they have to see something happen because of that fact. But for me, Madam Chair, and I know for my colleagues, our focus continues to be the pandemic. I use C-14 as an example because I think it's a great example in terms of how opposition has not responded well with the new throne speech. So we prorogue Parliament. We come in with a new throne speech. Committees start then to meet, and they want to do X, Y, and Z, including PROC. We're saying that we want to continue to focus, as we should, on the pandemic and fighting and minimizing the negative impacts of the pandemic. C-14, Madam Chair, as many will recall, was actually necessary because of the fall economic statement made by the Deputy Prime Minister back in November of last year. The legislation actually was tabled, I believe, in December. Think in terms of what's within that legislation. There are things that are there to support Canada's middle class through the child benefit program, businesses, the government's ability to borrow. Those are things that are there that are absolutely essential. Government has called the bill many occasions. it gets talked out or things will be brought up to prevent it from being debated. The only reason passed, and I remember back in January getting it out a second reading, was because opposition parties were ultimately shamed into seeing it, into why it is that they weren't passing this necessary legislation. And I'll hopefully expand later on that, Madam Chair. But I can tell you that when we looked at prorogation, and then you start talking about, well, we want witnesses, or we want this, and who should we be calling? I think, the Deputy Prime Minister is someone that would be able to provide the House a lot of details as to why it is so important that as a House that we remain focused on the coronavirus and the impacts it's having on our society. We should be taking advantage of the work that has been done by so many and looking at ways in which we can improve upon it. Our Prime Minister often talks about building back better. And that's not just a phrase. That's a reality. We can do that, Madam Chair. The opportunities is there. It's real. It's tangible. I'm even hopeful that we're going to see some of that, more of that, in the upcoming budget on the 19th. I think that we are in an opportunity in whatever capacity that we play, whether it's sitting in PROC and determining what it is that we should be talking about, or the agenda of PROC and how we might be able to assist the process, or it's in some other capacity. If you believe that the pandemic is the number one concern of Canadians, as I do, as Liberal members of Parliament do, I believe there is a need to refocus. You can still be a viable, strong, and healthy opposition party. I've said on several occasions before, I've been a parliamentarian for 30 years, over 20 of those years were actually in opposition. I like to think that being positive and creative didn't hurt me when I was in opposition. There are still many different areas in which one can explore and look at and contribute. Canadians aren't stupid. They will recognize the value of hard work. Madam Chair, I think, and I referenced it a little bit earlier in regards to the CERB program. Remember, I said that here's a program that started from nowhere.
Point of order. Relevance. Thank you. We're now going on to another tangent, so point of order.
No.
Thank you, Ms. Vecchio. I'll just remind the member to keep on the amendment by Mr. Turnbull. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that it's important that when we talk about programming and we talk about witnesses, that these, whomever the witnesses might be, whatever the agenda, the prorogation and the need for prorogation, needs to take into consideration what has been taking place in the last 12 months. And that's why I quickly had made reference to CERB. I think it's important part of the discussion and the debates. And it could even be something that might be raised with people that would be appearing before the committee, if in fact the committee is genuinely interested in what Canadians want Parliament to be talking about. And that's why, I believe that going to use CERB, looking at what it is that the government has done that justified it calling for a prorogation, is really important. We have, for all intents and purposes, provided a wide spectrum of programs, and those programs were put in place in good part in those months that followed the alarms going off on the coronavirus. And then once we got into the summertime, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, what became very clear was the need to be able to make changes to these programs because they were not perfect. And I would recognize that they were not perfect programs getting out. And that is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why there was the justification for the prorogation. And why it is that going forward, that if you're going to be dealing with the issue of prorogation or changing rules or anything of that nature, there's a responsibility of committee members and others to understand what led to the prorogation and why members in particular of the Liberal caucus have chosen to be able to talk about the importance of the coronavirus as the number one issue facing Canadians today. So I'm hoping that helps Ms. Pacheco understand why it is I'm talking about the program. Madam Chair, I had indicated that out of these suite of programs, that the one that really comes to my mind is the CERB program because of the numbers and where it came from. I indicated that virtually from nothing, a program to service just under 9 million Canadians. Why were programs of this nature so important? Because if you check with what people in our communities had to go through, one very quickly understands the importance of government having to be there for Canadians in a very real and tangible way, and that's what CERB was. Imagine, if you will, that whether it's the province of Ontario or the province of Manitoba or any other province or territory for that matter, where concerns are being raised and there's a need to be able to have people stay at home, not go to work. If I don't have to go to work, and I work at store X, that means I will likely lose my income while I'm not there. And in a situation like that, one needs to recognize that the same principle doesn't apply for utility bills or mortgage payments or the need to be able to have groceries. And that is the reason why the government had to bring forward a program that would support Canadians. And that was the essence of the CERB program. So it allowed for Canadians to have a disposable income during a very difficult time. Madam Chair, that is something that was absolutely critical for the Government of Canada. And I think most parliamentarians actually support the need for that particular program. You have the individuals, and that's the best example I could give for individuals. Then you have small businesses. Well, Madam Speaker, when you stop and you think about the damage to the economy and the impact on the economy, is there any wonder why the Prime Minister wouldn't have given that extra consideration going into the need to prorogue the session? You know, we've never faced that sort of a situation in our past where businesses are being forced to shut down. Many businesses, it's not an option, and businesses were having a very difficult time. So once again, the government needed to respond. And much like with the CERB program, of course, there's going to be some modifications to the program. Well, the small businesses program, Madam Chair, is something that was there to protect the long-term interests of Canadians as a whole. Let me explain. When we take a look at Canada's economy, we need to recognize that small businesses are the backbone to our economy. And even my conservative friends will acknowledge how important small businesses are. And I appreciate that. So these programs that we're having to reflect on in terms of being able to justify prorogation made a difference in a very tangible way. And let me give you some details on that, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair. Imagine, if you will, that you are a small business and you are being told that you're going to have to reduce your business expectations because of the coronavirus. As a result, you're now going to have to lay off some people. Those people that you're laying off are going to be coming upon some hard time. You might not even be able to restart up, nowhere near as quickly if the opportunity was there. If and what could government do to support situations of that nature? Well, for me, it was the wage subsidy program. The wage subsidy program literally provided support to tens of thousands of businesses across this country. It enabled businesses not only to survive, but for employees to be able to keep their jobs. And by doing that, that when the time is there and right, and we're into a position where we are going to be able to recover, what will happen is that we will see us in a better position because we would have had fewer bankruptcies, Madam Speaker or Madam Chair. It's the same thing with the rent subsidy program. Every government program that prevented a company from going bankrupt or assisted an employee to keep their job made a huge difference and continues to do so in terms of Canada's ability to be able to build back better going forward, to keep those jobs. In fact, after the second wave, I can remember the Deputy Prime Minister in the House doing a comparison about how it is that Canada as a whole was getting far greater success in recovering the jobs that were lost as a result of the coronavirus, more so than other countries around the world, in particular the United States. And it's because I believe that we were very successful at coming up with these programs to support small businesses. By doing that, supporting small businesses and supporting people through programs like CERB, the federal government was in a good position to be able to protect our long-term interests while at the same time be there for Canadians in a very real and tangible way during this very difficult time. Madam Chair, I'm not going to be able to stick around for much longer, but I did want to pick up on a couple of other points, because when I talk about small businesses, there's one other aspect in where government, I believe, really played a very important role. And this goes over and above, I could very easily have talked about other aspects of supporting small business, like the emergency business account, the credit availability account, the regional relief and recovery funds. There's different programs that have been put into place. But one of the things that I did want to provide a brief comment on was with respect to how it's not just the government of Canada. It is stakeholders that go beyond the national government, provincial governments and territories, Indigenous leaders, nonprofit organization, for-profit organizations. Some of these companies have been absolutely incredible. Remember when I talked about how this thing got underway in the first place, talking back in March, how much PPE was actually being produced in Canada? Do a comparison today. Look at the companies today that are providing the PPE for Canadians. There's no shortage today at all. That it's there, it's very real, and I'm talking in particular things such as the masks for public and the hand sanitizers. We had local businesses, and if I was the PS for procurement, I could probably go on to this. Mr. McKinnon could probably speak endlessly on this issue in terms of just the number of companies and how those companies have contributed to take back industries that we had lost. How we've stepped up, and when you talk about the situation that we were thrown into, that's what's impressed me the most, Madam Speaker or Madam Chair. is prorogation was necessary because it ensured that the House of Commons focus would be on the pandemic and minimizing the impacts of the coronavirus. All we need to do is to take our lead, as the Prime Minister did, from what Canadians were saying and doing. Whether it was the individual, the private company that retooled, to the nonprofit organizations that have stepped up to the plate. And Madam Chair, I hope to be able to expand on a number of these things later tonight, when we can talk about the immense contributions that have been made that ultimately sent a very clear message. And that message is very simple, that as a parliament, we needed to be focused on the coronavirus and minimizing the negative damage that was being caused by it. I am very proud of the Prime Minister's decision to prorogue the session. I'm quite happy at any point in time to have a discussion about when or when not a session should be prorogued. I would welcome that sort of a discussion, Madam Speaker. But I think it's important that as parliamentarians that we are aware as to why the Prime Minister prorogued. It's there. It's real, tangible, and from my perspective, I couldn't think of a better reason to do it. And I believe that Canadians see that. And we are starting to see results, Madam Chair. It's important that we recognize that we are not out of it. That third wave is there. It's real. It's killing people. Our hospitals are filling. We need to be aware that that third wave is there and it's real. Having said that the primary or one of the most important things that the government of Canada had to do was to acquire vaccinations. We made that very clear. We set the target months ago of 6 million by the end of March. We exceeded that, almost got close to 10 million. We will get close to 44 million by the end of June. Doses are coming, Madam Chair. But that does not mean that we should lose our focus. We still have to do what we can. And that's why I hope next go around to be able to talk a little bit more positively about some of the things that PROC could be doing, while reflecting, of course, on the amendments, Madam Chair. And I will be sure to read through both the motion and the amendment prior to this evening, just in case I might have deviated somewhat. But I can assure members, I really do appreciate the time that's been afforded to me this morning. And I look forward to being able to return later on this evening. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lamoureux. Hopefully, although we love hearing from you, hopefully you don't have to return this evening, but I guess time will tell. We do still have a speakers list.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Paddy Taylor.
I'm just wondering, I noticed that it's 12:51, and just wondering, since we have Mr. Lauzon, I believe, who is next on the list, and I'm assuming that my friend and colleague has a lot to say. I'm just wondering if we are planning on suspending the meeting at our regular time and starting up again on Thursday, or are we going to continue on? I just wanted to get a bit of a sense of what the plan of action is on that.
Well, thank you for that question. I guess I'm waiting for direction from you as members of the committee as to whether we will have consensus to suspend at our regularly scheduled time of 1 o'clock or carry on with the speakers list. So I guess I can put that question to the members to see if there is agreement on that at this point. If you do want to end at the scheduled time.
I think on behalf of the CPC, if we are suspending, that's okay, as long as we continue back to this discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Vecchio. So it seems like there is some support to suspend at 1 p.m. I don't know if, Mr. Lauzon, I don't know if it would be worth, I don't know how long your remarks are, if it would be worth moving on to you at this time, seeing as though we are going to suspend in 8 minutes. Would you like to pick up on Thursday's meeting at that point then?
Yeah, I would like to start right now for 8 minutes if you want, and I'll come back. I take my place for Thursday, so I'll come back, be the first one on Thursday.
Okay, all right, but you'd like to begin today then?
Yeah, I can go ahead today for
Okay.
8 minutes.
One thing I did also forget to mention at the beginning of the meeting is that we do have the issue of the main estimates as well, that we have, sorry, maybe I could have the clerk just update the committee that if eventually the committee does want to report back to the House on the main estimates, we do have witnesses that would be ready to come appear before committee, perhaps not this Thursday, but in the following week on Monday or next Thursday, so that we can complete that obligation. Justin, can you update the committee on that as to which witnesses would be willing to come forward?
Madam Chair, I did talk to the House of Commons administration with respect to the House of Commons main estimates that are referred to the committee, as well as to the Parliamentary Protective Services senior officials and to Elections Canada about a potential eventual appearance by them on main estimates before PROC. The main estimates are before PROC until the end of May. They did indicate to me that they are available to appear, and they probably can appear on relatively short notice. Likely, though, that would not necessarily include appearing 48 hours from now at our meeting on Thursday. But there shouldn't be a scheduling problem if we were looking at attempting to schedule at least some of those entities, possibly as early as next week.
Okay. So once again, it's up to the committee, but I did just want you to all be aware that that is a possibility if you wish it to be so. Okay, so Mr. Blakey, yes?
Just on that matter very quickly, Madam Chair, I'm just wondering, if we don't have a vote on the motion that's before the committee currently, before, when we might want or expect testimony on the estimates, is there a mechanism, whether it's unanimous consent or something else, to be able to receive those witnesses and then return to this debate? I'm just wondering if you or the clerk might have some advice on how we might go about implementing a negotiated solution if we're able to arrive at one.
Okay, I'll have the clerk supplement my answer, but according to my understanding, we could adjourn debate on this motion at this or at whatever point the committee wishes to adjourn debate on this motion, and it could be brought back at another time. So if it's up to the committee really if they would like to adjourn debate or resolve it through a vote. It would end the matter either end the matter or put the matter on pause, and then the committee could decide to move forward with the witnesses on the main estimates. And Justin, do you want to supplement my understanding with anything?
No, Madam Chair, I think that's pretty much exactly the procedural response. It would be for the committee, if it so wishes, to adjourn debate on this current motion, possibly schedule a meeting or two on main estimates, and then the committee could decide to resume debate on this motion and continue on with this debate.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I would only point out the obvious, that we still have 7 weeks to go before the deadline for estimates to be discussed. So that is, I believe, more than adequate time to continue on with this debate and perhaps see if we can resolve it by coming to a vote. So I would suggest we don't look at truncating this debate in any fashion until we come a little closer to a complete resolution. We've got enough time to bring witnesses forward, to do a thorough analysis of the estimates and vote on the estimates, because the deadline is not until the end of May. So I am certainly in favor of continuing the debate as opposed to adjournment.
Okay, no, thank you for your feedback on that. I think it gives the committee some idea where members might be at on the issue. You're right, the supplements are due sooner than the main estimates, so we do have some time on the main estimates. So it's really up to the committee, depending on how many meetings, but I do just want to make sure that everyone is aware, because sometimes I get emails after the fact, and so easier for me to give you all the same information at the same time, rather than have questions on that occur afterwards. So that's that. And like I said, there's a few motions that are have the appropriate notice given at this time, and a few that have just been put on notice, but the notice requirement has not been met as of yet. Mr. Lauzon, do you mind, because since we only have a couple of minutes left, that we pick up maybe right at the beginning from you on Thursday?
No problem.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I was going to interject for just 1 minute, but it took a little bit longer. Okay, so seeing as there's no more questions, are there any more questions? Just one last. All right. Meeting suspended until Thursday.